Very nice to meet you, Joshua. I'm very honored to have you here in this podcast as a guest. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you so much for having me, Showcase-san. I've been very excited for this conversation. I really appreciate all the work you do, and particularly being able to share experiences and philosophy around the world. So thank you.
Thank you. And I'm also very honored to be with you here as two of Dosanko from Hokkaido.
Yes, it's great. You know, I think that as I grew up, the word dosanko surprises many Japanese because it's usually not a word that somebody like me says. Most people look at me and call me a gaijin because I'm not from Japan. But if you're from Hokkaido, the people of Hokkaido embrace you. And so even though maybe I'm a nisemono dosanko because my grandfather and my father were not born in Hokkaido, my heart is a true dosanko with many of our ancestors connected there. So I'm very proud to share that title with you.
So I'm curious about your ancestors and also your story to be dosanko. So can we start from this point?
Sure, absolutely. You know, I think the word ancestor has lots of meaning, and I know you have been exploring this with many guests, but to me, the word ancestor not only encompasses my immediate family. So in terms of my immediate family, my parents moved to Hokkaido when I was 1 year old. They came from America. They were missionaries. They're Christian Southern Baptist missionaries. They have been in Japan for over 40 years, which means that I grew up my whole life as a child in Sapporo, in Minami-ku, in Hokkaido, that many people know very well. It's where they have the big Yuki Matsuri, the Winter Festival in Makomanai, where the self-defense forces are. My school was in Sumikawa, very close. But I think the ancestors that came before are even more important in the sense that while my parents were missionaries, my grandfathers fought against Japan. They were an Air Force pilot and a occupation force army officer. So to think that in only 2 generations, we've gone from mortal enemies trying to kill each other as Americans and Japanese to now the president of Japan Society that connects the US and Japan is pretty impressive. And I think if you go even further behind that, when you look at me as a European American, I'm about as American as you can get because my ancestors came from England in the first set of colonies in the United States, and they fought in the Revolutionary War that founded my country. The United States of America became that after fighting the British. And so even though my ancestors were from Britain, we made a very clear choice in 1776 to found this country. And I'm very proud of that heritage, even though I spent most of my early life in Japan and in Hokkaido, but I learned about my history. I learned about my family and my ancestors through the process of knowing that I was a little bit different than everybody else. But now I embrace both sides. I don't see a distinction between my American ancestors and the Japanese ancestors that I learned in my school. So to me, we're all one part of the human family.
So it's impressive that you can identify your ancestor so long. So back to 1773, 76.
Yeah.
Right.
It's interesting because I think to Japanese, it's kind of normal. Everybody can identify their family. It's so important to know what your family did. Many times people can trace their family 20, 30, 50 generations. Right. In America, it's a lot more unusual because we're a new country. But the good news is I had grandparents that were very focused on knowing where they came from and wanting to share their stories to the new generation. And in fact, I even have some of my cousins, they study ancestry. They work at institutions where they can trace it. So the reason I know my family's background is that my grandmother was what we call a daughter of the revolution. These are the people who founded America. You have to trace your family to one of these people. So I can trace my family to the founders. And even before the war, 1776, I can trace it. So it's very unusual for Americans, yes. But I think to Japanese, it's pretty atarimai and normal for them.
Yes, indeed. So you were not born but raised almost as a, all Japanese, surrounded by Japanese friends and people in Sapporo. So, how did you find as a son of missionary? How did you see the Japanese feeling of religion and also particularly Buddhism and ancestor?
No, it's a really good question. I don't think I fully appreciated when I was living in Japan how unique my experience was. It's only now that as I'm raising my own children, that I say, wow, how can I give them this experience of being able to understand differences? Because when I was growing up, everyone was so kind to me. And I think particularly in Hokkaido, maybe now in Hokkaido, there's many foreigners, many tourists in Japan now. But when I was growing up in the 1980s, there were very few people who looked like me. And most people that look like me were either Russian business people. Many people come to Otaru and Sapporo, but we did not have very many Americans in Hokkaido. And so therefore, I didn't have a choice in terms of who my friends were. It was kind of obvious that Japanese live in Japan, Dosanko live in Hokkaido. They are my friend, and I have to become one of them. I think one thing that Christian missionaries are very famous for is adapting to the environment they live in. I think all missionaries, they want to share their faith with someone. They have to understand the culture. They have to understand the community. Now, sometimes there's many bad things that happened, and many people have a bad image of missionaries. But I think my parents represent the best version. They want to understand Japan. They love Japan more than any other place in the world. They have a heart for Japan. I sometimes call Hokkaido my heartland, because my homeland, my passport is from America, but my heart belongs to Hokkaido in many ways. And I make a bit of a distinction between Hokkaido and Japan, because Hokkaido is the newest part of Japan, right? Japan is so old with thousands and centuries of history, but Hokkaido is relatively new. In some ways, it's a lot like America. It's a frontiersland. And so for me, when I was growing up in Japan, of course, my parents were very religious people, and I grew up in a church. But I think the great thing about Buddhism is more than just a religion, it's a way of life. And as a result, I think all Buddhist people are very accepting, and nobody lectures you. Nobody tells you you're wrong, you're doing these things badly. Sometimes there's many Christians who like to point the finger and lecture people, but they don't listen very well. Whereas I believe that Buddhism really asks everyone to look inside themselves and not just look outside. And I think this concept of ancestor is a really important one that particularly in the West, we forget about, because we're so focused on the future, we don't respect the past. But I think that probably from the Buddhist tradition, there's a sense of circularity where wherever we have come from with our ancestors, we will eventually end up at that point again, particularly in the Zen understanding of Buddhism that I've studied a lot. So I love this concept of ancestry and ancestors. I wish we paid more respect, particularly in America, because some of the problems that we're currently having in politics and in society, I think are cyclical. And if we were able to look at the past, we could learn for a better future.
So your father's church incorporated the ancestor worship habit when your father teach Christianity.
It's interesting. It's a really good point. When a Christian pastor preaches, he has to pick a part of the Bible. And many Southern Baptists, they only choose the New Testament because this is the new part that is after Jesus. So Jesus is teaching. But my father always equally taught from both sides of the Bible, the Old Testament, which is from the Jewish tradition, and the New Testament. And even my name, Joshua, that comes from the Old Testament. Joshua was the leader that followed Moses into the promised land, right? And so I think that my father, probably in his own way, was really respecting his ancestors. And in fact, my father's name is the same as his father's name, Carlton. It's a very old British name, but they chose not to give me that same name because that name is very old, but they wanted to keep the tradition alive. And so my middle name, William, is something that is connected to my family. So I think both in my father's preaching, particularly in Japan, where we always respected the people that came before us. I had many, Japanese grandparents, people that in some ways adopted us because my grandparents were living in America, but my parents wanted me to respect the older generation. And so the way you do that as a child is to spend time with senior people. And it's something that I love about Japanese culture, respecting our elders. In the same way that we respect children and take care of babies, I think in Japan, there's also respect of our senior citizens, but even more the ancestors that came before. So yes, I do think my own appreciation comes not necessarily from the Southern Baptists, but from my father's understanding of the Bible and of Christianity that has a nice balance between Old Testament and New Testament.
So the followers of your father's church appreciate the ancestor worship. So they go to cemetery in a particular season, like Obon or something, or
no, they don't. I think because Obon is such a
very
Japanese,
Buddhist.
it's a religious area, right? And in the same way that when somebody dies, there's a very particular Buddhist tradition, and when somebody's born, there may be Shinto tradition. In Japan, there's a mixing of cultures, religion, and traditions. I think Christianity doesn't have that. In other words, I think if you have like some type of ancestor worship at your house, I think that's a problem for most Christians and even my parents, right? If my father does not want to have a picture of his father in a place with a candle, that would be considered, I think the word worship is where there's a difference of opinion, right? Where Christians would say, no, we don't worship ancestors. We respect ancestors. Whereas we worship Jesus, we worship God. And I think this is where it's really great to have the discussion and debate about what beliefs are. And I think in many ways, Christians are very clear about what they believe and very clear that you can only worship one God. Whereas I think Buddhists would say, well, worshiping our ancestors is part of worshiping the eternal.
Buddha.
And there is a circular nature. Whereas I think Christians would say, no, there's only one path. And that's where you have a bit of a difference of, kind of religious beliefs.
I think in the United States, not as a religious worship, people are coming to appreciate the connection with their ancestry, lineage by searching DNA type through ancestry.com or something, right? So does it something you observe in the United States?
Absolutely. I mean, as I mentioned, there's entire businesses. My cousin is part of one of them, ancestry.com, where people are becoming very curious, particularly in this generation, to understand from where they came. Particularly as Americans, we are a country of immigrants. So we all came from somewhere else. Very few people were Native Americans. That's a very small population. Anybody that looks like me is not native to the United States. They came from somewhere else, whether it's Europe or Asia. And so I think that in the past, there's not been as much appreciation or understanding because unlike the Japanese tradition where every family respects, and as you said, at Obon, you go to the cemetery and pay respects, and every generation learns about their ancestors and how they came to be. Many Americans don't have those stories. And I think that my generation of Americans wants to hold on to something. They want to feel a sense of belonging and a place. And I think ancestors ground us. Even looking at the way that movies are coming out, right? My children love Moana, a Disney film. And Moana is very much about the ancestry of the kind of island nations and where they came from as sea voyagers. So I think it's very popular right now. I don't think it's kind of as appreciated. I think maybe you can appreciate this more because looking from Japan and going back and forth like you do, you can see, when you have a statue to a former leader or when you have some type of new holiday that's created, that's a form of celebrating or worshiping or respecting ancestors, whereas Americans may not think in those terms. They would say, it's about being inclusive, including all of the ancestors, not just the European ancestors, but also African ancestors and Asian ancestors that have made us so great as a country. So I think that's a great way to think about ancestors in a sense of helping us get to where we are today.
Yes, thank you for sharing that. So this project, Kamfa Tree Village project, is around Buddha Dharma. So the very core concept of Buddhism. And I'm curious about how you see the feature of Japanese philosophy as a person who have background in both countries. So in some content I watched before this podcast on you, so you talked about the number one mindset. So Japan are not pursuing to be number one in many ways. So you said that's the beauty of Japanese culture. So we are looking for what could be so how we can contribute to the today's world with many global issues. So what do you see could be discovered in Japanese culture?
It's a great question. It's something I think a lot about. I think this concept of, there's 192 countries in the world. If every country tried to be number one, it would be a disaster. And unfortunately, that has been a lot of our history. And that concept of number one is actually written by one of my mentors, the late Ezra Vogel from Harvard. He wrote a book about Japan as number one in the 1980s, where really at that time, the Japanese economic miracle and the success of this very small island nation with a very small population, but had one of the largest economies, number two in the world up until very recently. And so I think that concept of being a superpower, being the best and the biggest, which America has pursued since the end of World War II, and now China as a large power is also pursuing, but certainly Russia and other countries. Well, the beauty of Japan, I think, is that after World War II, Japan in some ways realized that being a military power was less important than being a kind of a country that functions. I think when I say that the beauty of Japan not pursuing number one is that it allows Japan to take the pressure off of trying to be everything to all people. In many ways, to me, that feels like a very Buddhist understanding. It's not perfection in the sense of being better than anyone else. It's perfection for you. Your nirvana is looked at internally. Your measure is different than someone else's. And so for me, to have a country that can personify this is really important in the world, because if everybody acts like America, it will be a bad world that we live in, because then everyone will compete. And if America's number one, then China is number two, will try to attack America to bring it down. Then everybody loses. And to me, that's a scarcity mindset. That's a lose-lose. There's no win-win here. Whereas I think that what Japanese culture, philosophy, and religion and history teaches us is that Japan had a period during the Warring States period where it was all warring all the time. But particularly because of that experience, Japanese really appreciate peace and harmony. And as a society that is very densely packed, that has very big cities that people live on top of each other, they have to respect and work with others. And so I think that type of teaching that I think does come from the Buddhist philosophy and Dharma and others is really necessary in the world. I work across the street from the United Nations. The United Nations is not working right now because there's two tiers of countries. There's the UN Security Council, the countries that won World War II, and the countries that are not. And a country like Japan pays more money to the UN, but has very little power. So Japan's power is not coming from its military power. It's coming from what I would call as soft power. Yes, economic power is important. Right now, the yen is very weak against the dollar. That may look like Japan is weak, but I think Japan's true superpower is its culture. It's its food. It's the way it approaches and welcomes people to come to and be part of a Japanese philosophy of well-being, where people are able to have a good well-being and to be happy, not just pursue material wealth. And to me, that's the danger of capitalism, right? Capitalism going too far makes people greedy and makes people not help each other. Whereas if we focus on what truly matters, our health, our family, our inner well-being, that allows us to share in our abundance and everybody can have enough. Like, why do we need billionaires, right? We don't need that much money. They will never spend all that money in their lifetime. And it creates a tier of people. God made us all the same. And so for me, I really appreciate Japan's role in the world to remind us that at one point in time, when Japan tried to take over the world through World War II, that did not lead to success. But now Japan is conquering the world through its imagination, through anime, video games, food, culture. So there's a different way of doing it where you don't try to take people over by force, but by invitation, to invite people to be part of a Japanese way that could be the human way. So that's what I think about when I think about kind of world politics and geopolitics that I'm trained in.
Yes. So, yeah, I agree with you. But especially in the field of politics and economy, where the nations tend to pursue becoming number one. In the field of culture, so there's no number one, right? So each culture has its own, uniqueness, and yeah. So as the president of Japan Society, yeah. So I agree that Japan has a big role to spread its beautiful philosophy. Um, what do you think is good way to do that? So yeah, I love to hear as a leader of this cultural initiative.
Yeah, I think one thing is to understand that there is no one way, right? So I think many institutions, many leaders like to say, follow me, follow my way. And in sometimes, even if we don't say it, there's an implicit understanding that we are the only way to some path, right? So in the same way that to the mountain, there may be one path to the top of Mount Fuji, but there are many paths along the way. And my job as a leader is to help you see the peak and to understand that we can go beyond where we are. There's a great African proverb. I don't know if there's a good one in Buddhism. You have to teach me it, but it says, to go fast, go alone. To go far, go together. And I think in many ways, that's the human experience. Yes, many times as a leader, as an organization, if you want to go very fast, you have to take the initiative. You have to have a startup. You have to have an entrepreneur, your spirit. But if you want to go far, you have to bring society with you. And that's what I think that, Japan Society has been around for about 117 years. We're one of the largest and one of the oldest US-Japan organizations. I don't interpret my mission of US-Japan as being restricted to only America and Japan. I see it as a global mission because the US and Japan represent the two most important economies, democracies, and peoples in the world where everybody will benefit from this relationship being strengthened. So I think the way that I think about and the way that Japan Society thinks about promoting is not to say Japanese culture is the best or Japan is number one, but to say, here's a unique perspective, particularly here in New York. It's a very different philosophy to have a minimalist mindset, to have a different view on what abundance looks like. We just had a great exhibit here that is directly tied to your tradition of Buddhist philosophy and Zenga painting, right? Where we had Hakuin and Jakuin. in American mindset, you have to reduce them to either artists, painters, or Buddhist monks. They cannot be both, right? But why do they have to be only an artist, and why do they have to only be, monks or priests? And to me, that's the beauty of Japan. It allows you to not be stuck in a box, but to give you a different perspective. I think one of the reasons that so many people in America and around the world want to visit Japan is after the COVID pandemic, there is a real appreciation for life and an understanding that in isolation, we are not our best version of ourselves. And in Japan, there's a harmonious society that works very well. People apologize when the train runs 1 minute late. People apologize if there's not enough, clean areas. People anticipate your needs before you even finish your meal. They're bringing you more based on what they like. The omotenashi of Japanese culture is what I think attracts. And so without criticizing and saying, oh, Japan is better than Korea or China, I think many people simply want to appreciate. And appreciation doesn't have to be based on rankings of number one to number 10. You can appreciate American and Japanese culture. And in many ways, they make each other better, as we see in the world. And that's what I see my role as, is to help Japan be a better version of itself, help America be a better version of itself through the introduction of differences and uniqueness and similarities and conversation between the US-Japan relationship. So I see it as a lifelong challenge. We will never reach the final goal of perfect US-Japan relations, no matter what the president and the prime minister do, because we are made up of so many different people, so many different pathways that all hopefully lead to a place where we can all live together in a better world and make the world a little bit better for our next generation than it was before us.
Yes. So thank you for reaching to that point. So to become, become good ancestors. So there are many things to do, but I love to listen to your thoughts about what can we stop in our generation to be a good ancestor for the future generation. I mean, as a Buddhist, Japanese Buddhist. So, as you know, one of the main role to be a monk, we lead a funeral ceremony, right? To punctuate, in a person's life, right? So at the end of their life, and punctuate the relationship between the people around. So obviously we need to stop something. We need to close something in our generation, not to bring to the next generation. So what should we stop? What should we have funeral for?
I love that analogy, and I think it's very appropriate because as a son of a pastor and a missionary, I also think in terms of these life moments, right? Like your entire life leads to, in some ways, a funeral ceremony. And how you approach that funeral ceremony is either filled with sadness and regret or happiness and relief, right? Depending on your belief.
Right.
And I think if we each looked at our own life on this earth in that way, it would be very difficult to leave the world a worse off place. But I think most people, unfortunately, and I will only speak for where I am here in America, only see the negative side of life, and they see the struggle and the hardship, as opposed to seeing the challenges that are overcome together. I think if I were to pick one thing that I wish my generation of Americans could let go of, it's the materialism. It's the need to accumulate. Just because I have more money than my parents does not make me a better person. It does not make me a happier person. In fact, I think science and philosophy shows that the richer you are financially, the poorer you are in your spirit. And so I would wish for my generation to return in some ways to the traditional scopes that have always led human beings to a better generation. I think maybe in my generation, people look to Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos, very rich, successful businessmen. But with all due respect, when I look at what they have done, what have they created? They've created a rocket, they've created Twitter, they've created these types of Tesla. But did they create a country? Did they create a movement? Did they create a revolution? My ancestors did those things, right? And so for me to aspire to what this generation's leader is not as inspirational as to previous generations' leaders. Going back to my namesake, the leaders like Moses and Joshua, and in the Japanese tradition, Tokugawa and others that have unified people. That's what, in my mind, would be a noble cause. And so if we could let go of the need to accumulate wealth, to try to protect and hoard it for ourselves, not just for our children, but for the sake of humanity, that is one thing. Because I think if you have that mindset, then other things, climate change and kind of AI and technology and humanity conversations become much easier, because we begin to look at things from a perspective of how can everyone benefit, not just one person out of 8 billion. And so I think that mindset is much more attuned to the Japanese understanding, because there's more built in a collective and a consensus. And I think maybe Buddhism is closer to helping people achieve that style of living than we practice in the West, where it becomes, almost like a sickness, where you're never satisfied, never enough. There's always more that you could get. That's what makes me scared. And I want my generation and my own group of leaders to let go of that. But the problem, of course, is everybody has to let go at the same time. If even one person holds on, everybody else will be jealous. And that's the difficulty.
Wow. Yeah, that's a beautiful idea. And I think so the younger generation would appreciate that idea, the becoming less materialistic, in my observation at least. So do you see the tendency in Japanese in the younger generation?
I think you're exactly right. I think that the younger generation really is hungry for something different. And I think you can see it in the workforce, right? Many of the younger generation, they don't care as much about high salaries. What they care about is impact and fulfillment. They want jobs that have meaning. They don't want to just do jobs for the sake of a salary and for a sake of security. They want to make a difference in their life and in their work. But something I think happens from when you're very young to when you become older. Because to me, the most beautiful stages of life when I look at people is at children's age and at grandparents' age. But somehow in between this period when you have the most power, right? When you're at the peak, as you and I are, it's much easier to become selfish and jealous and focused, as opposed to when you're a child and when you're a grandparent. You do live your life in a very different way. Maybe children don't fully appreciate the full world and they're very naive. But I think in every tradition, including the Christian tradition, Jesus told us to be more like children, to be more open, to not be worried about being hurt and about what others think, but to focus on yourself. And then when you become a grandparent, everything you do, you have a deep history and appreciation, and you look at things with a fresh set of eyes when you look at the new generation. So I think you're right that the young generation is very much more optimistic, and I have a lot of hope. But we have to make sure they don't become jaded when they become our age, because something happens when you become a leader. Something happens between that period that I worry that in all societies, all culture, that we really poison ourselves with different mindsets that I think are dangerous.
Yeah, so I need to keep it in mind. So for us, in Dosanko, in the same generation, in between.
Yes.
So let's help each other to not to be greedy.
I agree. And I think in many ways, that's why I appreciate you and your work, because I think maybe Japanese don't fully appreciate what you're doing, right? I think sometimes, particularly as a Buddhist, priest or monk, people may expect you to stay in one place and to do everything in Japanese, but you use your language and you speak to audiences that are global. And I've seen you speak to thousands of people that have come. And when you explain your own understanding, your own work, your own research, the projects you're doing, like this incredible project, they really are inspired. And I think that Japanese do very well when they see that other people respect their own thinking. So, for example, Japan society has had many artists and speakers and leaders that have come that have gotten more credit when they come to New York, because Japanese follow the way that Japanese are seen and the way Japan is seen in the world. And so I think the movement and the work you're doing, which you're very humble about, you're very focused on, is something that I hope that everyone in Japan, and indeed everyone in the world, and all fellow leaders like you and I, even if they're not from Hokkaido, but let's start with Hokkaido, because we share that heartland, and I think Hokkaido makes us who we are, and so we can appreciate that harmony between humanity and nature, and between rural and urban. So I think there's a lot there, and I am very committed to continuing to keep that positive outlook and trying to support each other, because it is not easy as a leader. I think there's a lot of work we have ahead, and there will be more challenges ahead.
Thank you so much. So, yeah, I really appreciate your contribution to this program, and I hope this, content will be listened to by many audience, not only in Hokkaido, Japan, but in the world.
Absolutely. Thank you for doing it. I'm sorry that we're doing it in English. That means only a certain group of people can appreciate, but we will find more ways of communicating through our hearts as well.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Bye.
Bye.